Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. Now, I think it's beyond any dispute that the Righteous Brothers are among the most talented of all vocal groups that there have ever been. The wonderful voices they went together so well. Bill Medley and Bobby Hatfield, they just really worked well together. Bill, of course, with the deep voice, and the higher voice of Bobby. And it just, as I said, worked wonderfully well. I think that's beyond dispute. And it's also beyond dispute the dispute? dispute that they had some of the finest singles of the 1960s, and they even with Rock and Roll Heaven had a bit of a revival in the 70s. So the question I want to ask about the Righteous Brothers is why in the minds of so many does the music sound dated? What really makes music sound dated? And that really got me thinking. The voice as an instrument is probably the least dateable of any because it never goes out of fashion. It's the oldest instrument because it was invented by God. It wasn't invented by an inventor like Adolf Sax and his saxophone. But at the same time, it's the newest instrument because people are being born every day and they have voices. Some you want to hear, some you don't, but they've got them. So what makes music sound dated? Well, it's mostly the production because instruments themselves, you don't get new instruments coming around all that often. How often does a new instrument get invented? Just think about it. Maybe once every 100 years, 200 years for major instruments, and maybe every 40 to 50 years for new iterations of familiar instruments. So, for instance, the Hammond organ being an electromechanical iteration of the ancient pipe organ, the electric guitar being an iteration of the acoustic guitar, which is much older. And then you have things like the stick, which you could say is part of the guitar family, and that was invented in the 70s, but you get the idea. So production is really the main thing. And the Righteous Brothers, at least for their early singles, they had a style of production known as the Wall of Sound. Now, this was pioneered by Phil Spector, who did in fact produce many of their biggest hits, including You've Lost That Love and Feeling. I mean, You Never Close Your Eyes, one of the best vocal introductions in all of music, if you ask me. Now, it is true Phil Spector's production style is extremely dated, and there's a reason for it. It was meant to sound good, not even necessarily on the hi-fi stereo systems of the day, but on the AM radio in the car. It was meant to sound larger than life in a low fidelity setting by having all so many instruments playing in unison. They call it tutti at once, with sort of so much overlapping percussion that the detail got lost. And the idea was to create what on AM radio would sound like a symphonic sound. I think that it can work on a high fidelity system a lot better than people think, but that wasn't really Phil Spector's audience. He was aiming for kids who in the early 60s didn't necessarily have access to the high quality sound systems that, let's say, a collector of Decca SLX or London Bluebacks would have, RCA Living Stereo, classical and jazz, the music for the somewhat older people. But I think that that would be unfair to the Righteous Brothers to judge them solely on the dated style of the production, because I think that the way that they sung together should be viewed as absolutely timeless. And they're sort of in terms of their historical musical memory in a position of limbo. On the one hand, they remain popular enough for people to have used them in movies and commercials for decades. I mean, famously in the 1990 film Ghost, or as Peter Griffin would say, Ghost, they used Unchained Melody, which was a song from the previous decade, written in the 50s, but made popular by the Righteous Brothers in the 60s. And so whenever you want to evoke something from in a broad sense, even though a lot of their songs were post 63, but this feeling of the pre JFK assassination, more innocent culture, people will look back to the Righteous Brothers. But again, I think that their ability to harmonize with each other, their choice of songs, and the many of the arrangements, particularly on songs like Ebb Tide. And it's actually my favorite one, but just once in my life it's my favorite Righteous Brothers song. But I have Joe Biden moments still. Ladies and gentlemen, the production, or rather the arrangements, are actually very modern, even though the way they were recorded, the production might have been very much of their time. Now, the multi-tracks, and again, this would have been maybe three channels at the most. I don't even know if they exist, but doing some remixing of whatever stems you might have had, which I'm guessing would be three, maybe four tracks on some of them, I think it could still yield some interesting things. You could, in other words, try to de-AMify, de-specterize the sound of the album, much like what Paul McCartney did with Let It Be. He did the Let It Be Naked, which removed Phil Spector's overdubs, which by the late 60s, early 70s, the wall of sound had evolved from the early 60s heyday. But nevertheless, if you were to strip back some of the more spectery specters, speaking of Ghost, I think you could actually really hear just how modern the arrangements were and just how timeless the vocals were. Do those tapes even still exist? Could anyone find them? Is there any impetus to do this kind of project? I don't know, but if the tapes are there, it ought to be done because I think you could really, if you were to do a clean rather than wall of sound mix of those great Righteous Brothers albums and singles, I think it would be so deeply revealing and it would show how modern the music actually was, even though it was buried underneath that quintessentially Phil Spector production. But that's just what I think. Let me know what you think. And as always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.